In today's discussion, we picture a world where language was music and words were melodies. In this world, one element shaped the very essence of communication: the accent. Greek accents wove a symphony of meaning, enhancing the poetry and the performance of ancient Greek literature. In today's episode, we demystify Greek accents and make them simple and approachable.
Well, welcome back to the second part of our journey into the world of Greek accents. In our previous episode, we delved into the concept of language as music, where we trace the history of the Greek accent. And today we continue our exploration by unraveling the rules that govern Greek accents. My aim in this episode is to demystify the rules and make this fascinating aspect of the Greek language simple and approachable. Now, before we delve into the rules of accent, it is important to understand, as I said in the last episode, the length of vowels in Greek. This is a very important aspect to understanding Greek accents. And in that, you were introduced to, of course, 7 vowels in Greek: alpha, epsilon, eta, iota, omicron, upsilon, and omega. And according to the Erasmian model, 2 of these vowels I said, epsilon and omicron, are always short and pronounced as e and a respectively. They take less time to say than their counterparts. On the other hand, eta and omega are always long and pronounced as a and o respectively. These are the eta and the omega longer versions of the epsilon and the omicron. Now, why is this important? This is important because the rules of accentuation are contingent upon the length of the last vowel of Greek words. And so it's important that we understand this. So you'll see these 4 categories here. We have vowels that are always short: epsilon, omicron, and then I'll come back to the other 2 in a minute. Those that are always long: eta and omega. Those that can be long or short, which is alpha, iota, and upsilon, and then the diphthongs. You see the combinations there. Now, there are 2 other diphthongs that you'll see in the always short category, and that is alpha iota and omicron iota. And what this is saying is that whenever you see alpha iota or omicron iota at the end of a word, in that diphthong at the end of the word, it is always considered short. Now, this is not true when you see an alpha iota or an omicron iota in the middle of a word. In that case, the diphthong is considered long. But when you see it at the end of a word, it is considered short for the purposes of accentuation. So let's move on to Greek accents. And there are 3 accents in Greek. 3 diacritical marks: the acute, the grave, and the circumflex. The acute slants up and to the right over a vowel, while the grave slants down to the right. The circumflex appears as a combination of a slant up and down. Some fonts make the circumflex look wavy, almost like a tilde. But here's the crucial point, is that accents appear only over vowels and diphthongs, but there are some specific rules about which ones they appear on. And that's why understanding the concept, as I said, of long and short vowels is pertinent. The first rule states that the acute accent can go over both long and short vowels. The same applies for the grave accent. It can go over both long and short vowels. However, the circumflex accent can only appear over long vowels or diphthongs. And the logic behind this rule is that there needs to be enough time for the sound of the vowel to go up and down, which aligns with the concept of pitch accent from the classical period. Now, one more thing to remember before we move on to the main rules. When accenting a diphthong, the accent goes over the second letter of the diphthong. By convention, if you put the accent over the first letter of a diphthong, it indicates that the 2 letters should be pronounced as separate vowels rather than as one sound or a diphthong. For instance, if you think of an example where a Greek word ends with omicron, upsilon, you will see this where you'll have a circumflex over that diphthong. But on the other hand, you may see a combination of two vowels where when they come together, they are meant to be separated. And when they are separated, you'll see an accent or a mark, diacritical mark, over the first of those vowels. Now, if you put an accent mark over the first letter, it just simply means those two letters are to be pronounced separate and not as a single sound or diphthong. Let's just talk for a minute about technical jargon. There are some technical words that we want to use just so that we're clear on the terminology around accentuation. And you will see that this is actually very simple and easy. And again, I want to refer you to Hansen and Quinn and their textbook on accentuation at pages 6 through 8, where you can read these terms and understand this. But first we have these terms here: ultima, penult, and antepenult. What does this stand for? Ultima is the last syllable. And here I'm going to represent this as a U. And then we have the penult, which is the second to last syllable, and I'm going to represent that as a P, and the antepenult, which is the third to last syllable, represented as A. So I have there A3, P2, U1. What does that mean? 1 means that this is the last syllable. 2 means this is the second to last, and 3 means this is the third to last. Or to look at the letters, the ultima, the penult, or the antepenult. It may be helpful for your mind. Some students, they tend to think better in terms of 1, 2, and 3. 1 being the last syllable, 2 being the one before that, and 3 being the one before that one. It may help your mind to think 1, 2, 3, or it may help you just to think in terms of ultima, penult, and antepenult, whichever is helpful. So the example that I put here is perikalesa. And you'll notice that there are 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 syllables, but accentuation can only happen on one of the last 3. Therefore, syllables 1 and 2 are out of consideration. So you have a superscript 1 next to sa, and that's saying that this is the ultima. You have a superscript 2 next to lambda epsilon. This is saying this is the penult. And then with kappa alpha, you see the superscript 3 saying this is the antepenult. So that's how we would mark it if we are practicing accentuation and figuring out where's the ultima, where's the penult, where's the antepenult. Now, this is an important rule. Greek accents can only appear, as I said, over one of the last 3 syllables of a word. So if a word is longer than 3 syllables, you'll only consider the last 3 when figuring out accents. Syllable length. When we talk about syllable length, this is the way we can categorize it. An acute accent may stand on a long or short syllable. And just like the acute, a grave may stand on a long or short syllable. The circumflex is the only one that's different. The circumflex can stand only on a long syllable. Now, let's just talk about the acute accent for a moment. Acutes can be placed over long or short vowels, and they can appear over the ultima, the penult, or the antepenult. So they can occur over 1, 2, or 3. Any of the last 3 syllables. But here's the twist. If the last syllable, that is the ultima, is long, meaning it has a long vowel or a diphthong, except, remember, omicron iota or alpha iota, if it has any other diphthong or any other long vowel, it carries more weight and it does not let the acute accent go back as far toward the beginning as it wants to be. See, usually the acute would prefer to be on the antepenult, right? That's the 3. That's the one that goes back as far as possible. But if the last syllable is long, the acute can only go as far back as the penult, which is second place. Now, let me provide a word just to illustrate this. Consider the word anthropos. Anthropos, which means man or human being. It has a short omicron in the last syllable, again according to Erasmian pronunciation, so it's pronounced as anthropos. The acute accent appears on the first syllable, which is the antepenult, which coincidentally is the antepenult, which is the third to last syllable. That's where it likes to be. But if we change the ending of that word to make it of a human being, anthropou, it no longer likes to have the acute accent as far back as the antepenult. Instead, it kind of pulls it over the omega in the middle of the penult to the second to last syllable. Fascinating, isn't it? And we'll go over plenty more of those examples. But for now, let's look at the grave and see how the grave accent behaves. Graves can be placed over, like the acute, long or short syllables or vowels, but here's the catch. They only appear on one syllable, specifically the ultima, which is the last syllable of a word. And here's an interesting tidbit. Some words expect an acute over the last syllable. They expect that. However, if the word is followed by another word without a pause in between, that is, there's no punctuation, the accent changes to a grave. So I'll give you an example of that to make this clear. In the bottom, you'll see where it says adelphos ke meter. Now, if you look at the word adelphos, you will notice that there is a grave over the omicron. But if you were to lift that word adelphos out of, let's say, a text and just put it as a standalone word on a piece of paper, you would need to change that grave back to an acute, because in its original form, that word is accentuated as an acute, but it moves to a grave or to a grave because there is a word following it and there is no intervening punctuation. So that is an interesting fact about how this acute accent, the grave, accent works. And this really comes into play when students are writing papers and they lift a word out to talk about its etymology, and they fail to change the accent back to an acute the way it is supposed to be because it showed up as a grave in the text because there was a word following without intervening punctuation. So it's good to be aware of that. And actually, if we're really going to be technical, the grave accent really has no other point of existence. Once the pitch accent went away and we got into just stress accent in the Koine period, the grave accent no longer had a pitch element. Therefore, the only purpose that it served was this very reason. The grave accent is simply an acute accent on the ultima that's been changed because a word follows it with no intervening punctuation, and so it had to become a grave. And that's the only reason why it exists. And that's the only value that it still has when we accent words today. It's really just an acute that had to change its angle, letting you know that a word is following with no intervening punctuation. So this is the grave. Now, when you look at the word for brother, it is adelphos, and it prefers, as I said, to be accentuated on the last syllable. In the dictionary, you'll see it with an acute over that last syllable. However, when you put it in a phrase or sentence like adelphos kai meter, which means brother and mother, it no longer wants an acute at the end of the word. It needs to change that acute to a grave. And similarly, with the word kai, which originally has an acute accent in the dictionary, it changes to a grave when combined with other words. That's the last syllable. So on the other hand, meter has an acute accent at the beginning of the word, and you don't have to worry about changing it with graves. Now let's look at the circumflex. The circumflex accent may stand either on either of the last two syllables, the ultima or the penult. The circumflex is only found on long vowels. So we say the accent, it can be placed over long vowels or diphthongs. And they can only appear again on the ultima or the penult. But here's a twist. If the last syllable is long, then Greek gets a little bit uncomfortable with the circumflex going as far back as it wants to, which is usually the penult. So if the circumflex is trying to be there on the penult, but the last syllable is long, then the accent has to change to an acute. And I'll give you an example to illustrate this. Consider the word doron, which means gift. It likes to have a circumflex over the second to last syllable, the omega. And it can do that because it has a short omicron in the last syllable. However, if we modify it to say doru in the genitive, that last syllable becomes a diphthong of omicron upsilon, which is considered long. And this makes Greek uncomfortable with a circumflex over the penult, so it will change it to an acute. So you would have doru, and over the omega you would see an acute. Doru. There would be an acute there instead of a circumflex. So in summary, these are the basic rules of accentuation. They're actually very simple. You must understand vowel quantity and length. Once we've covered that, these are the categories that you need to have in your mind. Syllable length. An acute may stand on a long or short syllable. A grave, in the same way, can stand over a long or short syllable. A circumflex can only stand on a long syllable. Then when we talk about placement, an acute may stand on any of the last three syllables of a word. A circumflex may stand on either of the last two syllables of a word, and a grave may stand on only the last syllable. When you put it all together, that means an acute accent can be on a long or short, and any of the last three syllables. A grave can be on a long or short, and only on the last syllable. And a circumflex can be on a long syllable only, and long vowel only, and on either of the last two syllables. Now, if I were to summarize the basic rules of accenting, I would say if you know these 4 rules, then you know how to accent Greek words. Now, there are some other complexities which we will look at. Essentially, nouns tend to operate one way and verbs tend to operate another way. And we will look at that. But if you can just fix these 4 rules into your head, then you'll know the essentials of what you need to know about accenting Greek words. And here are the rules. 4 basic rules. Number 1, if the last syllable is short, the accent may be on the ultima, the penult, or the antepenult. Example that we saw earlier is anthropos. Number 2, if the last syllable is short and the accent ends up on the penult, which is long, if that penult is long, then the accent will always be a circumflex. Example, doulos. Rule number 3. If the last syllable is long, the accent may be on the penult or the ultima. Okay, it can either be on the last or the second to last syllable, but it cannot be on the third to last. Example, anthropou. And rule number 4. If the last syllable is long and the accent ends up on the penult, then the accent will always be an acute. Example, doulos. These are the four basic rules. You get these rules down, and then you understand the essentials of how Greek accents work. All right, so what's next? So we've covered the general rules for accent, and in the first episode, we covered the history of the Greek accent and showed how the accent moved from music to pitch to stress to in the modern period where it's simply showing us where on what syllable the word is pronounced. And in the next video, we will look at the way accents behave with verbs and the way accents behave with nouns. In short, verbs are recessive. In recessive accentuation, the accent of a word shifts toward the end of the word, specifically to the last syllable or the syllable immediately preceding the last syllable, the ultima or the penultima. In persistent accent, which is nouns, persistent accentuation, the accent remains in the same position throughout the inflected pattern of that word, regardless of the addition of suffixes or endings. So nouns like to stay the same. I like to say nouns are conservative and verbs are liberal. Verbs are always going left and nouns are always staying to the right. And that's the way to think about accents. So I hope that this was helpful to you as we look at the general rules of accents. That's it. These are the general rules. And there are some words that follow these recessive patterns and these persistent patterns, which we'll look at in videos to come. And as you expand your vocabulary, you'll discover which pattern each word and word type follows. For more detailed rules and examples, make sure to check out the next video on this. Stay tuned as we continue our journey through accents.